When historians debate the most destructive rulers in European history, the same few names appear again and again. Tyrants who bled their kingdoms dry, kings whose appetites devoured both their families and their nations. But there is one monarch who stands apart from all the others, not because he was brilliant, or courageous, or even particularly clever, but because he embodied the very worst qualities a royal house could produce. His reign was not marked by victories in war or achievements in governance. It was marked by humiliation, debauchery, and the slow collapse of an empire. Generations of nobles tried to cover up his story, to rewrite the chronicles and soften the scandal, but the truth still bleeds through the gaps. And when you piece it together, you discover a nightmare that looks less like history and more like a grotesque, cautionary tale. This is the story of a man who turned his palace into a place of misery, who reduced his wives to shadows, and who left behind a civil war as his final legacy. His name was Ferdinand, remembered with the mocking title of the Felon King, and his life remains one of the most disturbing chapters of Europe's royal past. The roots of this tragedy stretch deep into the dynasty that produced him. Like so many royal families, the Bourbons had for centuries practiced a policy of intermarriage. Cousins wed cousins, uncles married nieces, and generation after generation, the gene pool narrowed. By the time Ferdinand was born, the physical and psychological toll of centuries of inbreeding was visible. In every feature of his body, he grew up frail, heavy-set, plagued by ailments, and cursed with a body that would later become the source of his greatest shame. In youth, he was a figure of ridicule among the courts of Europe, where princes were expected to dazzle with charm or skill. Ferdinand stumbled awkwardly, speaking with a lisp and moving with the sluggishness of a man twice his age. Yet he had one weapon that compensated for every humiliation: his claim to the Spanish throne. No matter how incompetent or malformed he seemed, the machinery of monarchy guaranteed him wealth, power, and the submission of those around him. This combination, deep insecurity paired with absolute authority, would prove fatal for both his wives and his kingdom. The first signs of disaster came early on his wedding night. He was barely 17 when he married his cousin, a princess brought from Naples. The union was meant to secure alliances, but inside the royal chambers it exposed a grotesque secret. Ferdinand's anatomy was so abnormal that even the physicians of the age struggled to describe it politely. It was not simply oversized, it was misshapen, unwieldy, and utterly unsuited for the purpose it was meant to serve. What should have been the simple consummation of a marriage turned into a months-long ordeal filled with humiliation, confusion, and physical pain. Letters from courtiers and relatives, written in coded phrases, reveal the scale of the disaster. The young bride wept nightly, unable to endure her husband's clumsy and painful attempts. Physicians were called, priests intervened, and even then the marriage remained unconsummated for nearly a year. When at last the act was completed, it brought no joy. Miscarriages followed, and within a few years the young queen was dead, her body broken long before its time. For Ferdinand, however, the experience planted a seed of obsession. The ridicule he had endured for being a man incapable of fulfilling his most basic duty turned into a manic determination to prove himself through excess. Once widowed, he sought out women wherever he could find them. Prostitutes, servants, noblewomen forced into his path. No one was safe. What began as compensation for humiliation soon metastasized into something darker. Ferdinand developed a grotesque pride in the very deformity that had once ruined him. He flaunted it like a weapon, boasting among his companions, comparing himself against them, and turning what should have been a private shame into a public spectacle. The stories from Madrid's brothels paint a chilling picture. Cloaked in secrecy, the king would descend into the red light districts of the capital, dragging along a circle of young aristocrats who shared his appetite for cruelty. In smoky rooms filled with wine and cheap perfume, the ruler of Spain treated his body as a carnival attraction. He forced competitions, demanded praise, and reduced women to nothing more than props in his desperate performance of masculinity. Witnesses described him keeping tokens of his encounters, morbid trophies that revealed his appetite was not simply for sex, but for domination, for physical proof of innocence destroyed. All the while his kingdom crumbled, Spain's overseas empire slipped away. Reformers and thinkers who called for modernization were silenced, often executed by royal decree. The economy rotted, the military weakened, and still the king gave himself nightly to his obsessions. For him, ruling was not about stewardship or duty. It was about indulgence, about distracting himself from the failures that multiplied around him. Ferdinand's second wife, Maria Isabel of Braganza, offered a stark contrast. Plain, practical, and devoted to culture, she tried to elevate the court by founding museums and supporting artists. But to her husband, she was little more than a womb. When she finally conceived, hope flickered that Spain might gain an heir and stability. That hope ended in a tragedy so brutal that even hardened courtiers recoiled. Complications during labor left physicians with a terrible choice. Save the mother or attempt to save the child? Ferdinand ordered them to prioritize the child, even if it meant sacrificing his queen. Without anesthesia, without mercy, surgeons cut into her body as she screamed in conscious agony, only to deliver a stillborn infant. The queen bled to death, and her death was whispered about as a murder, committed in the name of dynastic desperation. By now, Ferdinand's reputation across Europe was in tatters. Diplomats wrote of him with contempt, describing a king obsessed with his appetites and incapable of governance. Yet the royal machine continued to feed him new brides. His third marriage, to a princess raised in a convent, brought only more misery. The young bride, scarcely more than a child, recoiled in horror on their wedding night. Ignorant of the facts of life and terrified of her husband's monstrous appearance, she resisted him fiercely. The struggle dragged on for months, even years, until intervention came from the highest religious authority. Even then, she submitted only with rituals that drained the act of any intimacy. For a decade, their marriage remained barren, a cycle of fear, prayer, and failed attempts at reproduction. It was his fourth and final wife, Maria Cristina, who understood the reality of the situation. Unlike the others, she approached her role with cold calculation. She knew that Ferdinand's deformity was not just a personal shame, but a political crisis. Without heirs, the kingdom would fracture. With careful diplomacy, she persuaded him to adopt a medical solution, a cushion designed to limit the damage his body inflicted. Through this strange contrivance, Ferdinand finally fathered children, daughters who would inherit his troubled legacy. But even this apparent triumph carried the seeds of disaster. By altering the succession laws to ensure his daughter Isabella could rule, Ferdinand ignited a conflict that plunged Spain into civil war. The Carlist wars that followed were fought not simply over politics, but over the very legitimacy of a line of descent engineered through desperation and deformity. Tens of thousands would die in the chaos unleashed by a king who had spent his life indulging himself instead of strengthening his nation. When Ferdinand died, the relief within the palace was palpable, but death did not erase the stains he left behind. In his private chambers, his widow's attendants discovered a chest filled with trophies, cloths, and garments marked with the evidence of his conquests, each labeled and preserved. It was a grotesque archive of 2 decades of cruelty, proof that the king's obsessions had consumed not only his personal life, but also his sense of morality. The symbolism could not have been clearer. A ruler entrusted with the future of his nation had reduced his legacy to a collection of blood-stained rags. His empire had crumbled, his subjects had suffered, and his heirs had inherited a kingdom at war with itself. His body, his appetites, and his ego had shaped Spain more profoundly than any policy or battle. Historians debate many things, but on this point they agree. Ferdinand represents the nadir of monarchy. He was not merely incompetent. He was a man who weaponized his deformities, who allowed his personal dysfunction to metastasize into national catastrophe. His story shatters the myth of noble blood, exposing the monarchy not as a source of divine strength, but as a human institution vulnerable to the same weaknesses, perversions, and cruelties that afflict any man. In the end, the tale of the felon king is less about one individual than about a system that enabled him, a court that bowed to him even as he disgraced it, advisors who looked away while he destroyed lives, clergy who sanctioned his demands, and a nation that paid the ultimate price for the indulgence of one broken man. It is tempting to laugh at the grotesque details, to treat Ferdinand's story as a freakish footnote in royal history. But the consequences were real: dead queens, broken families, a nation plunged into civil war. He reminds us that leadership is not just about titles or bloodlines. It is about character, and when character is absent, when deformity of spirit meets absolute power, the result is horror. The felon king left behind heirs but no dignity, a nation but no stability, a story but no honor. His legacy lives on not in monuments or victories, but in whispered accounts of suffering, in the records of physicians who dared to write down the truth, and in the collective memory of a people who endured the worst that monarchy could produce. And so his story is told again and again, not because it celebrates him, but because it warns us. Power without restraint, indulgence without responsibility, and authority without morality will always lead to ruin. The palace that once echoed, with his laughter and his cruelty, now stands as a silent reminder of a reign that should never be repeated.